And I'd like to invite our next speaker now, Emma Louise, who is Head of Quality Assurance at the New Model Institute for Technology and Engineering in the UK.
Thank you, Pushpa. And hello again to lots of lovely colleagues I got to meet back in June for what I think has probably been so far my highlight of not this academic year, last academic year, but the calendar year. It was just such a great time to get together and talk to like-minded people. And I may come back to the fact that I came away going lesson planning, and some of you around who are here will know that we talked a lot about the importance of planning meaningful learning in the block. But anyway, I'll just share a quick overview of what I talked about at the conference, so hopefully you can all share that, and I'm going to try and whiz through this at greater speed. For those of you perhaps even in the UK who don't know very much about NMITE, that's understandable. We're a very small new provider based in Hereford in Herefordshire, so not far from Wales. We haven't been in existence for very long. We took our first students in September 2021 and had our first graduates in May 25, which is why I think it's given now we have to have a photo of them in every single presentation anyone from NMITE does, because we're so proud of the fact that we had some graduates. To give you an idea of scale, we've currently got under 150 students, but we have been and had the benefit of being block from the beginning, as we keep calling it. So we were designed into block, and quite a few other innovations around how we approach education, set up to be specialising in engineering and technology based education. I'll stress I'm not an engineer, but I'm getting to know more and more about how to educate engineers. So we are designed into block and based around a number of innovations which aren't innovations just to us, but I think the combination of all of those makes us quite different at the moment. Our curriculum is very much based around challenge-led learning, and it's been interesting hearing references to that. A very integrated approach to engineering education, not these silos of here's maths one, here's materials one. Those were already integrated so that students essentially learn some of that core knowledge through approaching problems rather than having like a module that's just about this particular bit of knowledge. They're expected to integrate from the beginning, and our learning model and delivery is really very much based around that. The students are expected to be in attendance 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, and yes, we do mean that, and yes, they ask us that question in about week 3 of starting with us. We were serious because it's designed to mirror the workplace. And whilst obviously that's not all educator time, the idea is that they'll be set up to work in teams. We have a huge amount of team-based assessment, substantial time with the academic team, significant, as I said, team working elements to it. And for that period of time, the students are in a studio. So we have a maximum of 30 students in one studio who, for the period of that block of learning, that's their learning space. It belongs to them. As far as is possible, even in engineering, we bring bits of kit to them. And it's only for the really, as I would call it, serious heavy stuff where they go to what we call the factory or the large learning spaces to use specialist kit. So the idea is the educators come into that studio, work with them, set challenges. We have industry partners coming in. So that's what NMITE looks like. We very much have a varied assessment strategy. We talk about no exams. We talk now more about no traditional exams because we do have a few things that look like Q&A and tutorial questions, which whilst they aren't exactly the same as your 3-hour closed book exam, they are sort of similar, but we're trying to relook at that. Actually, it's one of the pieces of work we're doing at the moment to relook at that. So what I wanted to talk about was briefly when we moved from, as I call it, big block, little block, because we moved from little blocks to slightly bigger blocks and why we did it and what we've learned doing it. Just to give you a very quick overview of where we were when I started at NMITE before we had our first students, we had a series of I would call them very small blocks. In UK terms, they were 8, 12 and 14 credits. So they ranged from 2 to 4 weeks. Each of those finished, you had 3 assessments in every single one. Anyone involved in academic administration around the table may start wincing, as I did at this period. Each of those had to be passed by the students. And when I arrived, I did ask which lunatic designed this. They were sat around the table to me. And so we moved on from there. Soon afterwards, we moved to a more standardized 15 credits, which was over 4 weeks. And for various reasons I'll come on to in a minute, we took the decision to move to a standard of 30 credits, which is for us equates to an 8-week block. But I'll explain to you why we did that. So why did we do this? Aside from many facts of like administrators were starting to faint regularly about the overload here, is we had feedback from both staff and students about assessment overloading. If you've got 3 assessments every 4 weeks, all of which have to be passed, marked, put in front of an external examiner, have an assessment board, it's quite a lot of work. And the students were overloaded and our staff were overloaded. And we also found that there was a huge amount of students saying to us they weren't able to really reflect on their learning or have that space to let it soak and think about it when it was continually 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks. We also found, and this is ironic because our program is our main program is integrated engineering. We were finding they weren't actually being able to integrate the knowledge they had because we sort of easily fell into the trap of, John talked about the sawtooth silos, that if you don't watch it, you have materials 1, materials 2, fluid dynamics 1, fluid dynamics 2. And where's that bit where they're actually pulling all this knowledge together to really address challenge-led problem-based learning? It was too high risk. Students had too many opportunities to fail, which wasn't fair to them. It wasn't reflective of their achievement. And it meant we were often having students having to take a break in learning because we were moving through blocks so rapidly they didn't have a chance to pick up those resets. And it was also, it felt like we were assessing too much. And when you've got, and I don't know if colleagues are running shorter length modules, particularly for us, we found if a student's sick for a day or two, just over staff members in a 4-week module, it has a really high impact on their ability to move through and pass that module. When I had a 2-week module, it was almost a student, you just couldn't be ill anywhere. No students could be, because if they missed half a day, it felt like they were missing quite a significant amount of what was important. We also really didn't have any time for formative assessment within the modules, which we felt was a real gap. Students were getting a chance. We talk a lot at NMITE about learning through failure, but if all your assessments are summative assessments that count to whether you pass a module, are you really giving students the chance to actually learn through failure by trying some assessments, getting meaningful feedback? We were also in the process of trying to introduce a non-accelerated route because our standard MEng is accelerated, which means that what would normally take 4 years in the UK, we deliver over 3 years, which means we have much shorter summer breaks. We were trying to introduce a non-accelerated route at the same time and trying to map blocks, timetables, so that staff weren't supposed to be in 2 places at the same once. All the sort of things that came out of that was one of the reasons we wanted to move to 30 credit blocks. Interestingly, we're now discovering some of the outworkings of some of the potential problems of the end of 30 credit week blocks, but that's another presentation for another day. So how did we do this? We essentially did the sort of whole curriculum redesign within, I would say, 6 months, 7 months. We started it with the aim of in 22-23 to introduce for our first students in September 23 coming into this. We very much used principles of constructive alignment, i.e. start at what we want the students to be able to do at the end of a module, and then work backwards from there. And we've, again, sort of almost came down from the program level outcomes, or year, as they might say, to then sort of try and divide up these blocks of learning, and all the time trying to avoid the trap of falling into Ellen Buck, the sort of shift and lift and put it down. So rather than trying to smoosh 15 credits to make 8 weeks, to try and make that learning that was going to be in this 30 credit block meaningful. And again, we very much focused on not what knowledge we were trying to get students into their brains, but what we wanted them to be able to do at the end. So in some of our module titles in engineering, we were what some in engineering say, right, quite revolutionary and moving away. Like our first block for students is called the engineers and society. So it's very much, quite a broad-based curriculum looking at pulling together the students placing themselves in this emerging world of engineering. What sort of engineers do you want to be? What do engineers do? So we tried to stick to that. The challenges we faced, were time. We thought we had lots of time. We didn't have lots of time. And actually, I think the time we had was too fragmented. I've spoken a lot to colleagues at DMU about sprint design methodology. And one of the key things about that is blocking some days of time. Well, we sort of tried to do it with half days every so often. And I think it wasn't as successful because what we ended up with was almost rushing at the end. Um, and one of the outworkings as well was some staff feeling, because even if you want to integrate learning, staff tend to be the person who teaches materials, the person who teaches fluid dynamics. The people often have that subject area expertise, but then how do you support them into writing blocks of learning that actually aren't theirs? They don't own them anymore. They are actually co-curricular designed with colleagues. Um, we're very much a teaching focused institution. I think that could be a really different challenge if you're very much research led as well, having spoken to some colleagues there, because people often design modules based on their particular research focus. If you take that away from them and say, actually, no, we want this lovely co-curricular, where does their expertise sit? I think it needs to be quite a supportive environment to get past that. Um, so we did have some staff feeling bruised, and I said this at the conference, and I think we didn't take enough time to sort of think about how that felt, how people felt loss of ownership, and maybe occasionally felt disenfranchised by that. And we've been working through some of those issues. The other thing we faced, and this is as in a subject area where we very much have professional body requirements, is we ended up sometimes with module learning outcomes that had a tendency to become a bit higher and abstract, and you're then faced with professional body requirements saying, well, where are they covering this bit of curriculum and that? And it's trying to manage those two competing tensions. We didn't want to overload the syllabus, because the tendency is then, well, we'll just make a syllabus that is 20 pages long that details every single thing they're going to cover. Didn't want to do that, but it's where you get the balance right between those two things. So just a few reflections and final thoughts, and then happy to take any questions. There's a potential, I think we may have moved from over assessing to under assessing. We do 3 assessments in every 30 credit block. We're not sure if that's enough, or some it works, some it doesn't, but we sort of went in with everyone will have 3 assessments, and I think maybe that's not the right thing to do in every place. I talked about, I think some of the module outcomes have become almost a bit too generic and could do with a little bit of tying down, but that's a work in progress. And in fact, the year after, in the past year, we've been through a bit of work around that, particularly because of accreditation requirements from our professional bodies. I know you'd expect me to say this. I think it's really important to have the quality people, she says, in the room. I know we're all quality, but those of us who have quality in our job title and the admin, John talked about pulling everyone together into the room. I think of the law of unintended consequences often here is, for example, the people who designed our very short week credit blocks didn't really think about what that would look like in terms of resits and assessment boards and assessment turnaround. You need that voice in the room going, have you really thought about the workload that you're doing with X, Y, and Z? I encourage everyone to, when you're actually looking at curriculum design, get as many people from a broader range of background in the room, because there's guaranteed to be someone there from timetabling who it's obvious to them why you're just about to trip over, and it's often not obvious to the subject experts. We've still got staff feeling something may have been lost from the move over, and again we're working through that and making sure we listen to, but hang on a second, we haven't quite got the coverage of mechatronics we had before, for example. And it's been important to be able to allow some sort of changes to come through. And a question that is more for myself and our institution is, we went with the minimum is 30, and colleagues in England will know that before they actually in this country gave a bit more specification about what they're doing with the lifelong learning entitlement, which is a particular thing they're doing over here. We all thought we had to have 30 credit blocks as a minimum to qualify for what is now going to be a particular stream of funding. And of course, it being government and the Department for Education, they just slightly changed their minds about that. So there's a lot of us who've moved to 30 credits and actually may now be looking back going, well, actually, we could get smaller blocks. And that's something we're reflecting on at NMITE. My final thoughts and some of the work that I keep planning to do and really do want to get round to is a sort of question provocation. Do we ever really have freedom to make the block size the size it really should be, just about the planned learning? There are so many other drivers that sit around, and I think we've heard about timetabling, staff availability, room availability, that have an impact on how you design your block of learning. And I'm sort of interested in where the tension and where that sits. And is there such a thing as an optimum block size? Question. And I'll finish there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emma. That was great presentation. I was actually just going to say that we in physiology have core concepts that we kind of focus on and align our learning outcomes to, and then we try and focus on the core concepts throughout the block just to be able to handle that cognitive load.
Yeah.
Which is kind of necessary in some of these heavy content units. And Sam also had a comment in terms of at the moment at Vic Uni, we're looking at 3 assessments in every block. But, one size approach doesn't, fit everyone. And we tend to over-assess in the block, definitely, for sure.
Although, as I would say, I think we're still reflecting on, have we moved to under? I've got colleagues who are worried that we're under assessing, and I don't know if that's a legacy issue from 3 assessments every 4 weeks, or if it's just that, there is something in that space, and we're just trying to work that out at the moment and sort of reflect. And of course, 3 assessments could be 3 really small assessments, 3 really big assessments. We've got someone doing, one of my colleagues is doing something very interesting with a particular assessment that is supposedly one big assessment, but they are doing a bit each week. And it's a really interesting little bit of work they're doing because it takes off some of the pressure on students, but they're being quite innovative in how they're approaching it. So lots of possibilities in that space. John.
Question from John. Yeah.
So I think, Emma, when you say, is there an optimum block size, I think there's the real tension between the length of the block and what's practical and what's doable timetable wise. I mean, I think for Pushpa, maybe a 24-week anatomy and physiology block might be just long enough to cover all the content, but how are we going to timetable that against 4-week blocks? Others might do better with 7 or 8, and there's that tension between the perfect size unit for every subject and the practicalities of timetabling. And that's where that idea of a innovative curriculum design comes in. We have this limited amount of time, so how do we chop up what we're doing so that we're not saying I have to do everything in 4 weeks for this unit, and this other unit I've got heaps of time in 4 weeks because I've only got 2 things to cover. I think we need to chop up everything. It's like that old joke about how do you get 4 elephants into a mini minor. Chop them up into little bits, put some in the front, some in the back, some in the driver's seat, some in the boot, and away you go. We need to chop up what we've got so that it makes sense in the practicalities that we have in terms of timetabling, rather than trying to imagine each unit in its own little perfect world, I suppose.
Yeah. I also recognise we have because in a sense NMITE's been newly designed into the block, both as a space as well as a concept, that we have the advantage of we don't have lecture theatres, so other institutions will be dealing with that, multiple departments trying to move students from here to here to here, and we're very lucky that it was very much the space is designed around the learning we want students to do, hence this idea that They, if of many of the things that I like about NMITE is this idea that they've got their space and that's theirs for that block of learning. Because, and we talked a lot about this, I know, back in June, the idea of students as a learning community who support each other, I think, can get lost in a traditional, students often don't see other students much more than once a week, because they might be doing 5 different optional modules with 5 different cohorts of students who they see for 1 hour a week in this seminar and 1 hour a week in a lecture. I think block gives, whether you're doing it like we are 5 days a week, however you're doing it, does pull together that idea of students as a learning community, and the fact that our students, both through team working and our ability to design our physical space for them, I do think it's a real strength of how we're doing block. But it's an advantage we have. I recognise not everyone does have. You are working around often institutions and spaces that were designed for a very different mode of delivery.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things. We have to, everybody's going to have a different context, both in terms of their cohort, but also their physical and logistical constraints. And we have to, that's why I think every block is realized differently, because of that interesting combination of circumstances.
Thank you,
That's
John.
me.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Thank you so much for joining us, Emma. I know you've got lots of stuff going on. Appreciate you coming today.